Thank you, Julianne. So this is our last session. This is the makeup session. Poor Dr. Sassaman got stuck on a murder trial when he was to be our first speaker of this session. So he's been kind enough to rearrange his life to be the last speaker of our series. I want to thank the Zoom folk and the folk in the room for being extraordinarily attentive, awake, and engaged through this Climate Conversations Amplified program. I'm tremendously excited of the level of engagement and interest, intelligence, and commitment of the group here at OCAMIC, and it has been a real honor and a real pleasure to help facilitate this organization of this program. I'm pretty sure that there is no one here who wants to sign the Right to Clean Water petition who has not yet signed the Clean Water petition, because I've been haranguing you for 6 weeks. But if I missed you, they're on the back table. And this was mentioned last week along the lines of the Montana youth who have won their constitutional right to complain that they're not getting a clean environment. This is the same level of constitutional amendment for the state of Florida. We have laws on the books that are not being enforced, and this gives an individual citizen the right to sue the government to do what they're supposed to do. So, and it's nonpartisan, and we need 900,000 signatures by November. So if you haven't signed it, or if you're willing to take a few for your friends and neighbors, I'll leave them on the back table. We just had, Alice was our hostess for lunch. We've just had the most delightful conversation with Dr. Ken Sassaman. Besides what I'm going to read you about his awesome academic credentials, he has actually quite a unique background. He's admitted to being raised in an auto mechanic shop and being the first person in his family to go to college, and obviously then the first person to get a PhD in anthropology. What he is now is the Hyatt and C.C. Brown Professor of Florida Archaeology here at UF, and he's got 40 years of research in the American Southeast, centering on community formation, regional interactions, and the technological change among Native Americans. He has ongoing field work on the Gulf Coast, and he's investigating the connection between the experience and the expectation of environmental change. He has authored or edited 10 books and over 100 articles and chapters, and he's not that old. He's the co-author of the textbook Archaeology of Ancient North America, published in 2020. Let's give a warm OCAMIC welcome to Dr. Ken Sassaman.
Thank you, Ellen. I appreciate that nice introduction. And I appreciate, too, having the chance to come and speak with you about this very important topic. I was scheduled earlier, but I got called to jury duty. And yeah, I spent 3 days in testimony only to be dismissed at the end of the third day as the alternate. I think they understood. I think the prosecution knew that I was sympathetic towards the defendant. So he was quick to get rid of me, I'm afraid. Yeah, please, thank you. So keeping with your theme, I'm here to give the long-term, the long view perspective on sea level rise. Certainly, it's been on a lot of folks' mind now for quite a few years, if not decades, although it still hasn't achieved the public relevance or credibility, I think, to be parlayed into meaningful public policy. That's what we were talking about at lunch a little bit with Ellen, too, is that despite all the evidence that would support the assertion that our futures will be a lot wetter, particularly along the coast, than they are today, we don't see a lot of action with respect to that. As an archaeologist, an archaeologist dealing with millennia of Native American history, it's just patently obvious to me that changes in sea level were critical in affecting people's distributions on the landscape, the choices they made about what to procure from the environment, how much investment they would put into permanent infrastructure, and also the social networks that they participated in that acted as safeguards against failure when local communities, were affected by rapid climate change, they had friends and allies that they could count on for relocating to safer lands. So I think most of you understand that when you talk to people about sea level rise, one of the things that's frustrating is that you might get the knee-jerk reaction was like, well, this isn't the first time it happened. You know, why are we making such a fuss over this thing? But I think people that are smart enough to read the science and treat it as honest reporting come to understand that the rate at which it's changing now is exacerbated by our own behaviors, right? So certainly since industrialization, we've contributed to a process that may or may not have unfolded on its own at a slower rate. But if we look far back enough in time, we certainly come to understand that there were times in the ancient past when we experienced rising seas at a rate comparable to what's projected for the near-term future. So if we go back 125,000 years ago, for instance, the last time we had a full interglacial period when it was really warm, sea levels were up 6 meters from where they are now. So Florida was missing a third of the peninsula, or a third of the peninsula was underwater. The Everglades was completely underwater. Sarasota was a little island, right? And there was virtually nothing left, anything south of, say, Orlando area. At 6 meters of rise, that's the projection that we have going forward if the Greenland ice sheets completely collapse and the West Antarctic ice sheet goes away. We're going to have 5 to 6 meters of rise. We'll see conditions like we had 125,000 years ago. Now, on the flip side of that, during the peak of the last glacial period, the last glacial maximum, 24,000 years ago, right, when it was really cold, Florida was twice as broad as it is today. And to be, for instance, in Tampa 20,000 years ago was to be in Central Florida. Sea level was down over 100 meters, as much as 120 meters from present levels. And that means the coast was out hundreds of kilometers, at least the Gulf Coast where I work, from where it is today, right? So we see those extremes and we can just plot that geologically. Humans don't enter the picture in Florida or the greater Southeast until about 15,000 years ago. That was during the last ice age, the late Pleistocene. Sea level was still down about 80 meters. The coastline in the Gulf was about 250 kilometers west of its present position. So it was drastically different. And since then, it's gone up generally. But what archaeologists debate and geologists debate about a lot was, what was the rate of that? How consistent was that trajectory? And how many reversals did we have? And when did they take place? We certainly have times we know over the last 15,000 years where in the backdrop of overall sea level rise, there's been periods when it appears to have regressed, gone down because of global cooling. So it's very complicated. It's just not the bathtub model of like, turn on the faucet, watch the water come up, and over time we're going to have higher levels. Now, I think you all can appreciate it's the old story of the frog in the boiling pot, right? If sea level rise over the time of human history in the Southeast was incremental and gradual, I'm not sure we would ever notice it in generational time. We would know if we compared historic records. We would say, my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather lived 20 kilometers offshore, but now that's been flooded over those many generations, right? If it was slow and incremental like that, I'm pretty sure that it would not filter into the human consciousness that it's a problem worth confronting. It would simply just be a nuisance, right? Oh, that house that was built 250 years ago is no longer inhabitable. But we all know that it's actually events, not climate change, but weather events that capture our attention, get drilled down deep into our psyche to cause us to think twice about taking the risk of building in places that are vulnerable. So this is an island called McClambery Key. It's almost gone. This picture was taken about 15 years ago after a nor'easter came through in March, I think it was. This is just north of Cedar Key. Most of you probably know Cedar Key area, and I'll show you here a map in a minute. And as you can see what happened with this storm, this was just a storm that came and went in the course of a day and a half, but it undermined the shoreline and caused these massive hardwoods to topple, taking with their root balls a lot of the archaeological deposits in the surrounding soil. All that shell that you see in the foreground there, that is archaeological shell from a midden that's being eroded beneath these trees, behind these trees here. Not gradually, just from day-to-day tidal fluctuations, but from massive events like this. And so, you know, we certainly, let me get my other thing here. We certainly take advantage of this as archaeologists. The contrast there is not too good, but you can see the broad outlines of that. That's generally the coastline of our study area of what's known the Lower Swanee Archaeological Survey. This is the town of Cedar Key here. Halfway up there, you see the mouth of the Swanee River. That's the town of Swanee. And at the north end, the town of Horseshoe Beach. Those are the only three towns in this roughly 40-kilometer stretch of coastline, because it's part of a National Wildlife Refuge complex, both the Lower Swanee National Wildlife Refuge and the Cedar Key National Wildlife Refuge. In other words, undeveloped land. If you know Cedar Key, it's very quaint and having sort of that 19th century feel for it. No McDonald's, no traffic lights, no real traffic to worry about other than festival days, right? So you get a sense that it's a place that, you know, it sounds, you know, cliche to say it's frozen in time, but it's definitely not invited the development that would make it look like, you know, Tampa or Miami or something like that had historical circumstances been different. So this is a great place to do archaeology, and under the sponsorship of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who administers these or manages these refuges, we've simply been surveying the shoreline for now 15 years, and we have about 110 sites on record. And finding sites is not that difficult because of what you see on the left part of this slide. The shorelines are eroding because of climate events exacerbated by rising sea. And with those exposures becomes conspicuousness. They're easy to find, right? You don't have to go around scratching in the earth to look for these things. You just paddle along the shoreline in a kayak or a canoe or a small little john boat, and you're going to find these archaeological sites. Cemeteries are washing out that date back to 5,000 years ago. Villages that date as early as 4,000 years ago are washing out. And we're starting to see, you know, the erasure of a prehistoric, ancient archaeological record of coastal living. Not the first time it's happened, because all we have to do now is just go out into the water and we find these now submerged shorelines from 5,000, 6,000, 8,000, 10,000 years ago that are testimony to coastal living way back then when sea levels were much lower than they are today. I have one graduate student, he's not out there today, but he spent the last 6 months with a diving crew looking for submerged sites. He hasn't had too much luck yet, but he's doing a good job mapping that bathymetry, the topography under the water. They call it bathymetry. He's been mapping that, looking for potential sites of archaeological discovery. I'm sure that someday we'll be able to do that. We know that record's there. The question is, have all these storms, like the one that's resulted on the erosion on the left there, kind of erased that record? You know, the storms could very well have done it through just the surf damage that comes with them. All right, events. Events are what we remember. We don't live climate, we live weather. Weather is the human manifestation of climate, and it occurs for us with a regularity that we would like to expect, that it's warm in the summer, cool in the winter. We live in a subtropical environment. The further north we go, of course, the colder it's going to get. The further south we go, the warmer it's going to get till we hit the equator and get on the other side of it. We understand the sort of like the normality or the rhythm of weather change, even over the course of the day, you know, that it warms up and so forth. It's the things that disrupt that cycle or that rhythm that capture our attention and cause us to take pause, right? So Hurricane Michael in 2018, the little town of Mexico Beach was pretty much leveled. I went there just a couple of months ago, or months after this. You remember, this is about, wasn't much after, long after this that COVID struck. And I had cabin fever right away. And we were told to stay home and do our classes by Zoom. And I said to my wife, I said, I'm getting in my truck and I'm driving to Mexico Beach, right? Actually, it was a good bit later than that when I finally made this trip. I had been there once before, but you can see the devastation here. And the question then becomes, you know, is this a bellwether for everyone in the future that's living on the coast, or all the other towns that have had histories of hurricanes, are they all vulnerable like this? Or is this an exception because mostly it was 1950s bungalows that were not fortified for this thing? You see that one big house there that's standing? You know, that was built for 180 mile an hour winds. You know, it's got hurricane roof, hurricane windows. It was built for this kind of weather. And maybe that's the future. But the point of showing you this is that this is one event, and you hear this on the news, right? You hear this, you read this all the time. In the context of climate change and sea level rise, events like this are often characterized as being more severe and coming at greater frequency than ever before. Well, that's an historical question. What's the data? How bad have they been in the past? How often do we experience them? And are we picking up an increase in the frequency and severity of storms that would lead us to believe that in addition to global warming and sea level rise, we've disrupted the system so much that it's in chaos. And we're getting events that nobody's ever seen before, right? Magnitude of events that no one's ever experienced before. I mean, look at a hurricane that just hit Baja, right? Everybody's making a point. Hey, nobody's seen this. And I heard 28 years. I heard 70 years. I had 50-some years. I don't know what the truth is, but everybody knows it never rains in Southern California. Well, hell, it did. It's still raining, right? And they're having mudslides and all kinds of stuff. So my question here is, what's the relationship between the experience of climate events like this and then the long-term trends of climate change, weather events like this, and a long-term trend of climate change? And then from a human point of view, what's the relationship between the experience of things like these weather events and the expectation of humans that this is going to happen again in the future, right? If this was a one-off, we rebuild Mexico Beach. If it's going to happen again in 2032, it'd be a fool's errand, unless you have enough wealth and engineering to build this so fortified that it wouldn't be impacted at all. And you know what that means? Gentrification. That means only the wealthy will survive, right? And then you got to worry about insurance companies. What are they going to do? Who's going to build a $5 million house with no insurance? Only if you got $5 billion would you do something like that, right? So even though, you know, we're talking about the ancient past here, I'm very much concerned about figuring out ways to get the archaeological record of dealing with climate events like this, or weather events like this and climate change, parlayed into policy relevant information for ourselves, right? Why look back? Because of the uncertainty looking forward. You may well know from your lecture series or your own reading that even the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was unwilling to put into their projections the magnitude of sea level rise going forward because of the uncertainty of the rate by which the Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets will collapse. And now recently, just in the last few months, I'm reading articles saying it's happening faster than we ever imagined. Now people are getting real serious about this. Again, 6 meters rise if those ice sheets collapse in Florida. But because of the uncertainty, an historical scientist, like a historical geologist like Andrea Dutton here, now at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, she was at UF until Wisconsin came a-courting, and then she went there, and right after she got to Wisconsin, she was named the MacArthur Genius Award winner, right? So what is she doing that's so cool? She's saying, hey, we don't know what the future looks like, but when's the last time we had 6 meters of sea level rise? Well, that was 125,000 years ago, and there's the evidence there. This is Carl down in the Keys that is basically a material record of a time when there was 5 to 6 more meters of water than there is today. That's pretty cool. So what can she do now? She can start to interrogate this record for the rate at which that occurred and the magnitude of the events that were part of that process, and give us a little bit better sense of what that's going to look like going forward, right? So I'm trying to do the same thing with archaeology. When's the last time we had human experiences with drastic climate change that led to human responses that we could describe as transformational, right? Not just let's pick up the family and move a mile inland, but completely giving up the ship, completely giving up the ghost, and taking their future in a totally different direction. That's kind of what it's going to take for us. Nobody wants to do that, but that's what it's going to take, right? And it means that the younger generation, of course, is going to figure this out. All right, so here's where we are on the left. You see a map of Florida with its modern outline, and there's what's called the Clovis shoreline. That was a shoreline about 13,000 years ago. Clovis is the cultural tradition of the late Ice Age people who we know were here in Florida, as well as all throughout the continental United States, up into southern Canada a little bit, northern Mexico a little bit. They're pretty much a North American original, and they were very, very successful at killing large megafauna, the proboscideans, the elephants, the mastodon, mammoth, extinct sloth, horse, you name it, right? They were the people basically taking advantage of those large creatures at the end of the Ice Age. And when they showed up in Florida, Florida was twice as broad as it is today, if not more. Sea level was down 80 meters. Their coastal record is so deep and so far offshore, no one's ever been able to document a stitch of it. We don't even know if it exists. You know, just because there was a shoreline there 13,000 years ago, and we had people, and we had people in the landscape, doesn't mean that they were coastal dwellers. They may have like popped in for a vacation, but it doesn't mean that they built pole houses and set up villages there. They're following, we know in the interior of Florida what they're doing. They're going to sinkholes. Sinkholes, water's down, not only is sea level down, groundwater's down. Big sinkholes like Little Salt Spring near Sarasota, which is many tens of meters deep, was largely dry. There was water in the bottom of it, but today the water is all the way to the surface. So Paleo-Indians like this went there because the elephants went there. It was the only place where they could get potable water, really. So we know that. We just don't know about the coastal thing. What's important here with this one on the left is the rate at which the change occurred, right? Oops, wrong button. Sorry. Okay, for those of you on Zoom, I'm looking at the bottom left here. You see the curve going from 120 meters below present all the way up to the present here. And then about 15,000 years ago is when people show up a little shortly after that. You can see how far down it was. It's not only that it was down, but the rate at which it came up thereafter was dramatic. So much so that if you were born on the coast 13,000 years ago, by the time you were 5 years old, your coastal home would be underwater. By the time you were middle age, it would be 10 kilometers offshore. If we were living that rate of change today, I don't think you'd have a hard time convincing people we got a problem, right? Right? And we haven't seen that kind of rate of change in a long time, but we're seeing it now. It'll unfold into the future. You can see what happened thereafter. It started, especially after 5,000 years ago, it really started to flatline. 5,000 years ago, it came within its modern position, and then it fluctuated a half meter, a meter, but it stayed pretty much within its modern configuration until now. So what's called the hockey stick of sea level rise curves, you guys know this term. It's a metaphor for basically saying we now have a point of inflection and a drastic uptick in the rate at which sea level is rising because of greenhouse gas emissions. It's our hockey stick. We created it. Well, there was one 15,000 years ago. There was a hockey stick. So hypothetically, like we saw with Andrea Dutton and the corals, hypothetically, we'd say the most relevant historic data on the human impact of sea level rise is going to come from the record of archaeology 15 to 13,000 years ago. All right, now some of you guys are like right away going, yeah, right. Okay, the problem with that argument is there's not a lot of comparability between people 13,000 years ago and modern urban living, right? No concrete, no asphalt, no hardened infrastructure, no nuclear reactors, no water treatment plants, no sewage systems, people living off the land, which means basically then they're able to adjust as environment changes by picking up and moving, right? Okay, that's all true. So I'm not here to try to fool you into thinking that Paleo Indians are just like people from Miami and we can like treat them the same and think about these things being comparable. That's not the case. But there is the argument to be made that we could look at Native American experience and response to climate change and ask some more basic questions, like having experienced change in the past, were they able to use that memory, both individual and collective, to plan for futures in ways that reduce their vulnerabilities? I'd like to think yes, because when you look at Native American philosophy, you look at Native American epistemology, the way they know about the world, they're definitely multi-generational. They put a lot of credence into the knowledge of the ancestors. And so if you go back generations and say, hey, grandpa, grandma, what was it like when you were a child? How much has it changed since you were a child? What are the anticipated changes in the future based on your experience? We kind of don't do that much, even though we're very smart people with lots of science. We don't really draw on the knowledge of those who came before, because we live in a time where change is almost imperceivable, except for technology and consumables. I work in Cedar Key area. I have people there that have been living there all their life, and you ask them how much does sea level come up, they'll say none. No, yeah. They'll say none because it hasn't impacted their life yet. They've had none of those events. Plus, they haven't really been paying attention to a deep historic record. Why should they? They're still out there being very successful at clamming, moving their plots around when necessary. We also have this other phenomena that I won't be able to get into, but it took a long time for me to learn about this. I just assumed naively when I started this project 15,000 years ago that when water came up, it would immediately inundate near shore land. It's the bathtub model. You raise the water level up, you're going to flood the land there. What happens in the long term in an area like the Gulf Coast is that if you have slow, gradual rise, the sediment that exists in the system accretes roughly at the same rate as the water, so both the land and the water are rising up gradually. The same with oyster biotherms. Oysters are able to accrete, the oyster reefs, they accrete at the same rate as sea level rise, so you can get continuity over centuries. Even though you've had change in water levels, you still have the same level of production and health and well-being of the oysters. So it's hard to perceive change if you just take the short term or if you only look in certain places, right? And again, if events what really matter, then go look at those events. See if you can find those events and see what outcome they had. Okay, so this is kind of my question for this talk. And then I'm going to show you some archaeological evidence, and it's going to be maybe a little unexpected. I hope that's a little unexpected for you. But here's what I got to say. If you're living through rapid changes in sea level, like they did in the late Pleistocene and early post-glacial period, that happens repeatedly, wouldn't you think that it would structure culture in a way that would anticipate change going forward, that the expectation for the future would be predicated on these experiences of the past? And whether that future ever unfolds the way people expect it, it's certainly, if it results in them reducing the vulnerability that they have to change, they've done a good thing for themselves. Whether it's conscious or not, they produce conditions of sustainability in the way that they go about living. But we're going to begin actually at a time when the rate of change was suppressed, was almost flatlined, like it's been for many centuries now for us, right? Still punctuated. The hurricanes were always there. The nor'easters came through occasionally. But we'll take a look at this time roughly about 1,800 years ago as our beginning point, and then we'll work backwards and then we'll come back to this point, okay? I don't know how long I've been talking, but I'm doing okay. Oh, you be careful. We could be here at 4:30. I teach my classes at UF, the time's up, and I look at the kids, I'm like, I got 5 more minutes, you guys okay? They're always like, oh, they got 5 more minutes, you okay? And they're always like, no. Gotta get to the next class, right? All right, let's start about 1,800 years ago on the Gulf Coast, and we have this incredible tradition of civic ceremonial centers. It's a term archaeologists use, and it means two things. There were places people lived, civic, there were villages, right? But they're ceremonial because there's a lot of infrastructure that's ritual, there's a lot of ritual activity, and they were places where people gathered from far and wide, they would come to these places for religious activities. So places of pilgrimage, places that had historical and ancestral importance to them, they would go to routinely. Every one of them, there's 3 of them here that I'm highlighting. You can see them here in the map to the left. To the north is Garden Patch, that's near Horseshoe Beach. The one that is that I've worked on with my students for a long time is Shell Mound, just north of Cedar Key. And then the third you may know about is Crystal River. It's a state park. Anybody been to Crystal River? Yeah, it's a nice little state park. Most of the mounds are in pretty good shape. They're still there. They have signage. They have a little museum. It's a pretty cool place. This is the platform mound here, the big platform mound at Crystal River. Those on Zoom, the bottom right is the Crystal River. Shell Mound's a big U-shaped construction. Garden Patch has a series of mounds with a plaza in the middle. No particular configuration there, although I can see all kinds of patterning that not everybody else would agree with. They all started out as cemeteries. Before they became places of living, before they became places of gathering, they were places to dispose of the deceased. And those started as early as about 2,800 years ago. So quite a few centuries before these became places of living and gathering. Mound building is common throughout all this tradition. The mounds aren't always the same. Sometimes they're platform mounds, like this one here at Crystal River, flat on the top, where you could build buildings, you could hold dances, you could have gatherings. People did do those sorts of things up there. And then unusual things, we call them shell rings. The U-shaped one at Shell Mound is not a complete circle, but it's a big U-shaped configuration. Oh, it's about 25 feet tall. It's about 200 by 200 feet, something like that, with a plaza in the interior there. And again, a series of mounds at Garden Patch. They all have mounds, but they vary in form, orientation, scale. They all have materials that came from somewhere else. They have non-local items. How do we know that? Because sometimes it's quite obvious. A big green stone celt made out of, beautiful igneous rock did not come from Florida. We have nothing like that, right? That came out of eastern Alabama or western Georgia. Soapstone came out of the Appalachians. We have nothing like that. Sometimes it's obvious. What's not so obvious, and this is the brilliance of my graduate students, is that the clay used to make the pottery, quite often at sites like this, came from places far away. And they know that by doing neutron activation analysis of the clay, comparing it to geological sources of clay. And then they do petrography too, where they thin section the pottery and they characterize the aplastics, the temper that went into it. So we know that 50% of the pottery that shows up at these places was made tens, if not hundreds of kilometers away. At this particular site, for instance, here at Shell Mound, we know there's pottery there that came from the St. Johns River Valley, right? From DeLand, an area like DeLand. They were places of everyday living, but the scale of these places belies the small size of the communities. We don't think that a place like Shell Mound, despite the fact you probably could have put 1,000 people in there in small little huts, we don't think there were more than 100 people living there at any one time. But if you showed up there on a summer solstice, it was Woodstock, right? People were gathering from hither and yon. They still do. We go there every summer solstice for a celebration. So these are significant places in the landscape. And why these particular places? Well, right away you could say they're ancestral. They have cemeteries. They must be really important, right? They have connections. But the other thing, you got to step back from that and look at the bigger picture here, is that almost all these things have now been demonstrated that have astronomical alignments. They're placed in places that help people on this earth orient themselves to the cosmos, be that the sun, the moon, other stars and planets. And this is not unusual for non-Western people. They're so well attuned to the sky. The sky for them is part of their cosmos that they interact with regularly. And they're very much interested in the movements of all the bodies in the sky as ways of timing their rituals, right? So there's certain times when you get alignments. Obviously, if you're into astrology, you're saying this is a no-brainer, right? There's certain times to do certain things when certain bodies in the sky are aligned, or they're in certain houses of an astronomical array, right? So let me show you what's going on here, what I know and love so well, and that is the landscape in which Shell Mound and Garden Patch, in particular, Cedar Key up to Horseshoe Beach, was a place during the Ice Age when water was down 80 plus meters, 100 plus meters, was a place where all these dunes formed from prevailing winds. They're called Parabolic Dunes. These are different than Barchant Dunes. These are dunes that migrate in the direction of the prevailing winds. So you can see this example here. The winds are blowing. Those of you in Zoom, the bottom left here, you're seeing an example, a little diagram here of winds that basically create what's called a blowout, cause the sand to accumulate in that direction and then migrate in that direction as that blowout becomes a basin. And then it leaves behind these trailing arms, so you end up with something that's a parabola. Okay, they're called parabolic dunes. Well, there they are. These have been mapped by geologists out of the University of South Florida. You can see some of these aren't showing up too well because of the bad contrast here. You can see the ones that are now completely inundated. I can remember to hold this up, I'm sorry. Completely inundated now that they've mapped the remnants of. These were obviously sand, and as sea level came up, it eroded the sand, redistributed the sand, and reconfigured the shoreline because of that. All right, so here's the kicker. This is not unusual for the southeastern United States. You can find these in South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama. There happens to be a cluster here in this area. But the winds were blowing consistently during the Ice Age out of the southwest towards the northeast at an azimuth, a direction of 60 degrees east of north. Anybody here know what the significance of 60 degrees east of north is with respect to the sun? It's the northern point on the horizon of the rising sun at the summer solstice. So this landscape, this is all happenstance. It's not the hand of God. It's not the plan of some, universal genius or anything like that. It just happens to be, stuff happens. It just happens to be the pattern of wind blowing during the Ice Age that led to an enormous landscape of dunes, some of which are 2 kilometers long, 25 meters tall at the highest point, that all happen to be oriented to the solstices. So you could stand at the mouth of any one of these things, say right here, the opening, right in the middle, look towards the apex on June 21st, and you'll see the sun rising right at that point. You could be standing at the apex on December 21st, and you'll see the reciprocal, the setting winter solstice sun, and you have the complete solar cycle of the year manifested or materialized in landscape features that you could see year round. You didn't have to wait for December 21st or June 21st or December 21st to tell your young children about the solstices. You could just basically use this as a mnemonic device. Now, I'm inferring this, so don't take this as fact, it's just hypothesis, that anyone who passed through this landscape that was attuned to the cycles of the sun would have known that this was a special place. So they cited their ritual infrastructure in this special place. Yes, sir.
Can you repeat that for?
Well, the moon's on its orbital cycle is 18.4-year cycle, and the sun's on a 1-year cycle. So that happens occasionally, but not annually, right? But when it does happen, it's a big deal. So we know that this is the case at Cahokia. You guys know about Cahokia, America's first city, east of St. Louis. AD 1050, it was built by design, right? That's aligned to the moon and the sun. And then you guys know about Chaco Canyon in northwest New Mexico, Pueblo Bonito, that's aligned to the moon and the sun. So people are way smarter than me about astronomy. They've documented everything you're talking about. But when you throw the moon into the equation, you're talking about complex, very complex patterning that requires specialists. And it requires intergenerational observation. You could teach somebody about the sun cycle in a few years because you'd see year after year after year it's doing the same thing. The moon, you're going to have to, if you're going to go through 2 cycles, you're going through 37, 38 years of human experience. Now it's going to be something multi-generational. So you raise a good point, because I think once you put the moon into the equation, then astronomy for the ancient people of North America was high science, really high, just like it is today, but in ways that's mobilized for ritual purposes. We'll see right now. The bottom line here, just to cut to the chase, is that Native people in general, and indigenous people in general, meaning everybody who isn't subject to the Enlightenment of Europe, right? If you want to put it that way, right? They treat the world animistically, right? The earth is a being. It's not inanimate matter. It's the mother, right? They also treat the trees and the water and the birds and the fish and the deer as animate creatures that they have a reciprocal relationship to. In fact, the creation myths of most people, like the Algonquians of the Great Lakes region, is that humans were formed last, which is consistent with Judeo-Christian doctrine. But unlike Judeo-Christian doctrine, humans being formed last doesn't mean they're the most special or closest to God. It means they're latecomers, and if they want to learn anything about the world, they better consult the animals and the plants that came before, right? It's a twist of logic that leads to the conclusion that we have an obligation to reciprocate to everything that makes it possible for us to live. The air, the water, the food, right? And we don't have that kind of relationship to the earth anymore. We lost it. I don't know if we'll ever get it back, but dealing with Native American collaborators, I've learned a lot from them, and I can see how it plays out in day-to-day living. But things like this on the landscape would signal to them incredible import. Do you know what's under Stonehenge that was discovered about a decade ago? Paraglacial fissures that are oriented to the solstices. Scratches in the rock created by glaciers that, 6,000 years ago, people must have walked through that landscape and said, holy cow, look at that. This is predisposed to being a portal. It's a portal into the other world. Let's build Stonehenge here, right? You get the picture, right? None of this stuff is happenstance. It's all connecting the dots. People basically figuring this stuff out. Okay. All right. 13 years ago, we got a call from the state archaeologist. We've been working out here for a few years in this area. We got a call from the state archaeologist. There's bodies washing out of the beach face of McClamry Key. Go check it out. We went out there, and sure enough, there was human bone, several individuals, at least, I think at that time we figured out there was at least 4. The Seminole tribe of Florida was consulted, as they always are and should be. And the Seminole tribe said, okay, that's too bad, but leave them alone. If the sea's going to take them, so be it. We're not going to mess with them. Just leave them alone. So we did. And then a few days later, there was another report that came by way of law enforcement that there were looters out there looting the burials for spear points and shell beads. So then the Seminoles said, okay, help us get them out of the ground. So there's a representative from the tribe there, National Park Service, Bureau of Archaeological Research, my grad students. In 2 days, we salvaged 32 individuals. And we think we got them all. We probably missed a few, but we got them out. And they're now sitting in Tallahassee awaiting reburial at the behest of the Seminole tribe of Florida, which again is consistent with the law and the right thing to do just morally, right? All right, here's the thing about these burials that fascinated me. They're all secondary burials. They weren't buried in their primary in-flesh form. They were just bundles of bones, mostly long bones, legs, arms, and the skull, and usually the mandible, but none of the axial skeleton, none of the ribs, none of the verts, none of the fingers, none of the toes, none of the wrists, none of the ankles, right? So this is not unusual. Secondary burials are not unusual in ancestral Native North America. Nothing too weird about that. But the artifacts associated with these individuals date to about 4,500 years ago. And at that time, this would have been about 2 or 3 kilometers, maybe more, landward. And they were born on the end of the arm of one of these parabolic dunes. All right, now since then, we put together a pattern here. There's two other places where this happened. Those on Zoom, if you look at the map on the left there, Bird Island to the north, and then Cat Island just to the north of the mouth of the Swanee River. Those are two other places where cemeteries have washed out in recent years that date roughly to about 5,000 to 4,000 years ago and consist mostly, if not exclusively, of secondary burials. So now we got a pattern. It wasn't just a one-off, but we have people basically putting burials of individuals, the bones of individuals who were previously buried, in these secondary cemeteries. My hypothesis is they were dug up and relocated as they were being eroded by rising sea, which is what's going on right now. In fact, what we're doing right now, right? What we're doing here was happening 5,000 years ago with ancestral Native North American people. They dug up their ancestors, they moved them landward to a safer spot. Little did they know 5,000 years later, they would be exposed again. I don't imagine they were thinking that far ahead or needed to. Okay, that's a hypothesis, not a fact. For me to test that scientifically, I would probably want to go find where the original cemeteries were, and there's no guarantee they'd be preserved. But I do imagine the original cemetery for McClamory was Seahorse Key, which is the highest elevation in the Gulf of Mexico, 55 feet above sea level, the biggest parabolic dune in the region, but largely eroded. Most of the arms have been eroded. The sand from those arms have been redistributed into sand shoals that support seagrasses. They're very important for the whelks out there, the lightning whelk in particular. And then I could hypothesize that these points on the landscape directly south of each one of these was also the original cemetery. I don't think we'll ever be able to test that, but that's my model, that's my idea. And as you can see then, there's a pattern to this. Not only do we have solstice angles that emulate the dunes, but these are meridians that connect up ancestral cemeteries with relocated cemeteries. Meridians are north-south lines, and they divide the sun cycle at midpoint when the sun's directly overhead. And if you follow that direct overhead orientation of the sun over the course of the year, you're going to have a north-south line right above your head here, right? The meridian, right? So there's two things going on. We got solstice angles and we got meridians that are, apparently being followed for relocating these people as they're being exposed. Okay, so there's our three. From an aerial photograph, the one at the bottom's McClamory, that's the one that we salvaged. Cat Island to the north at the mouth of the Swanee, and Bird Island near Horseshoe Beach. All at the end of Parabolic Dunes, all secondary burials, at least not exclusively in some cases, but mostly, and then all dating between 5,000 and 4,000 years ago. They're all at the exact same elevation. There's a parabolic dune that's still in pretty good shape. This is Butler Island. There's the town of Horseshoe Beach. So Butler Island is actually in pretty good shape compared to most of its counterparts. And then these islands that are distal or off the ends of the distal arms of these things may have originally been attached to that. Granted, this has all been reconfigured by storms and erosion. It's hard to know what the original configuration is, but you get a sense of that. I do want to point out one other thing just briefly, and that is that at this site, Bird Island, this was salvaged by Florida State University back in the early 80s, I believe it was associated with a large cache of broken soapstone vessels. So soapstone's a talcaceous rock. It's like talc. They call it soapstone because it feels like soap, and it's easy to carve like a bar of ivory. So big pieces of soapstone coming out of the Appalachians, carved into bowls. There's an example of one there you can see in the upper right. These are just sherds of broken pieces. They get to be quite large. They're usually about this size, but they can be about this big. And they're coming from sources in the Appalachians. So the closest source for us in Florida would be roughly Atlanta. The Atlanta area was actually a huge source of soapstone before the city came online. Okay, why am I telling you that? This is a different story. I'd come back another day and talk to you about this if you want. But the reason I tell you this is because soapstone caches show up at coastal sites from Jacksonville. Get folks on Zoom, the bottom right map shows red circles around caches of soapstone vessels. Jacksonville, Horseshoe Beach area, Choctawhatchee Bay, the mouth of the Pearl River, and then at a place called Poverty Point. Poverty Point is America's enigma. Archaeologists debate it constantly. We don't really understand it, but here's an artist's reconstruction of what it looks like. A kilometer wide, 6 concentric ridges of earth with a massive bird effigy mound at the west end of it. This is actually facing, this little illustration here is actually facing southwest, so west in this direction here. And there's a cache of soapstone vessels there west of that biggest mound that was dug up in the 50s that have never been dated, but probably date to the abandonment of the site about 3,200 years ago. And then the one at the mouth of the Pearl River, we did actually date with radiocarbon dating of the soot. You guys see the black in here? There's soot on the inside and outside of these. That's at the mouth of the Pearl River right here. I just dated that recently. We know what that dates to. All these caches, including the one here in Florida, were in place long after the cemeteries were abandoned by centuries. So they're going back. They know these places existed on the landscape. They're going back and putting offerings in the places that were abandoned. And I'll get back to this point here in a minute, but we don't really understand why they ever left in the first place, because sea level stopped rising at that point, and in fact may have actually started to regress. We don't really know this. This is something geologists have never been able to nail down. They're not going to dismiss it out of hand, but archaeologists have this problem. Archaeologists have this problem everywhere from Virginia all the way down to Florida, all the way across to Texas. At about 3,500 years ago, we start seeing coastal sites abandoned, completely abandoned. Not just like, let's tweak the model a little bit, like pack up and get the hell out of here kind of abandonment. And they're coming back and putting offerings in places where they live, like the soapstone vessels, but we have no human presence there for several centuries, at least not until about 2,700 years ago. So the water starts receding maybe as early as 3,500 years ago, but at 3,200 years ago, we probably hit the point of no return. Did in fact sea level drop during what might be called a neoglacial, a small little ice age that caused these places to be unproductive? You know, they'd still be inhabitable. You know, water going down doesn't sound like a problem, except if you're dependent on the estuarine environment for your economy. Now the estuarine environment's disrupted. The seagrasses are disrupted. The oysters are disrupted. What happened to the mullet? They're not showing up anymore. They're not doing their normal migration patterns or whatnot. Things get disrupted, people leave. They come back eventually, but it's going to be a while. It's going to be several centuries. So here we get back to where we were at the beginning, the Civic ceremonial centers. And I do want to give you some detail about what we find at this place and why we think it is their effort to ritually intervene against climate change in ways that would increase their sustainability and decrease their vulnerability in the long term. All right, the last relocation of a cemetery took place somewhere between 2,800 and 2,700 years ago, and it ended up being a place known today as Palmetto Mound. For those of you on Zoom, this is on the left side of the screen. You'll see an island off of the peninsula that has Shell Mound and Dennis Creek. There's a place called Palmetto Mound. Palmetto Mound is the densest and longest lived cemetery that we know of anywhere in the Gulf Coast of the southeastern United States. Totally unassuming. It would all fit in this room. And it's not very high, maybe about 5 feet. But it was densely packed with the remains of humans, and it's got an incredible density, just an incredible density, or did, of objects, including whole pots. Now, most of you probably know if you put fancy objects in the ground, you leave them there, somebody's going to come dig them up as loot, as treasure. You know, archaeologists want information, but, you know, collectors want objects. Indiana Jones was not an archaeologist. He was an antiquarian. He was after objects, fancy objects, not just like, you know, somebody's broken stone tool. He's looking for the Ark of the Covenant, right? He's after big fancy things. Well, a guy like Montague Talent, you know, I shouldn't criticize these guys too much because it was the way it was back then, that you went out and dug up Indian sites and found relics and sold them or kept them if you liked to keep them as curios. He collected hundreds and hundreds of whole vessels and donated them eventually to the South Florida Museum in Bradenton. That's a good thing, but we don't have really good records about the context. When you take objects out of the ground without details of where it came from, you really diminish its scientific value, right? It's still a valuable object to study, but you don't know what was associated with it, where it was placed, and so forth. Be that as it may, this obviously was a very important place on the landscape. It started 800 BC, roughly 2,800 years ago. I think it was another emplacement on the meridian. This is directly north of McClamry Key, which is directly north of Seahorse Key. So we have a nice north-south line. Oh, and by the way, we're going to rebury the individuals from McClamry Key on the same meridian going north up towards the Swanee River, or at least that's the tentative plan. Okay, so Palmetto Mound was already here. Shell Mound was not. But Shell Mound comes online. Oh, we'll skip that. We don't need that. Shell Mound comes online at about AD 200, 1,800 years ago, when geologists tell us we had a major event. They call it an overstep event. That means there was a big storm that did some significant erosion of the coastline, and with the erosion of the coastline, the water intruded, it encroached. So when we talk about, again, when we talk about sea level rise, we can talk about long-term change, but we also have to pay attention to these events that reconfigure the shoreline and cause areas to be flooded without any significant increase in the water level. You've taken earth away that's now going to be replaced by water. So Shell Mound comes online about 200 AD. Shortly thereafter, they start digging large holes. And by the way, let me point this out first. This configuration is a modern configuration, but this underwent an evolution. It simply started as an occupation of the dune arm. Remember, this is the Parabolic Dune. The cemetery's over here, but you have this Parabolic Dune that's labeled right here, this reddish color, the whitish shell on top, but the reddish color is a natural geological formation that provided some relief from flooding. So let's just think practical here. AD 200, there's a big flooding event. All of a sudden, they start living on top of the dune. That's a no-brainer. You know, you just get up out of the water and find secure settlement on top of this thing. But simultaneously, they start doing something that we hadn't seen before, archaeologically. They start digging these large pits into the dune sands, into which they eventually backfilled with the remains of large feasts, big feasts, way beyond Thanksgiving. All right, what do we know about this? Let me give you some details. I won't bore you with all the details, but it's some pretty interesting stuff here. The pits are filled with food remains and they're filled with pottery. Let's start with the pottery. The pottery includes vessels like this one here. You can see the outline of the reconstruction of its width and its height, but this is a portion of the rim that's large enough and has enough of an arc that we can project the entire circumference of it and know that that's about a 15-gallon pot. About a pot about this big. That's a big pot, right? You wouldn't cook grits in there for breakfast in the morning unless you were feeding 300 people, right? Okay. Also in these, by the way, they're sloppy. And I don't mean that as a value judgment. They were put together hastily, not intended to last, and then in this case, deliberately broken. That's actually a kill hole right there. Folks from Zoom, if you see that semicircular piece of that rim shirt of that pot, that's the hole that was banged out by using a hammer, hitting it on the inside and knocking a hole out the way you might see with a BB gun shooting at a Coke bottle. Makes that kind of cone break that you get. They're deliberately killing these things or breaking these things and throwing them in the pit. In the pit as well are small little serving vessels that are highly refined, well-made, painted, decorated, and our neutron activation analysis shows they're coming from somewhere else. A lot of them are coming out of the middle of St. John's River Valley. Okay. What else is in the pit is a lot of bone. Tons of mullet. You guys like mullet? Fried mullet? Yeah, it's great. Mullet dip, smoked mullet. Oh, yeah, go to Cedar Key, get some smoked mullet. You'll be a fan, right? They can be caught in large numbers. In the old days, they would go out to the mouth of Swanee. They would start running, I think, in the fall, and the fishing boats would go out basically with the migrating populations that were all fattened up from, gorging themselves for months before the spawning run, and they would be taken by the thousands by fishing boats in the 1800s, right? We know that historically. Well, the Native American people were doing that too, and I'll show you how they got them, but there's tons of mullet. The most important thing in all this, though, is this bird, the white ibis. The upper one is a juvenile, the bottom one's an adult, and you guys have them around here at Oak Hammock, right? You go out in the morning, it's like, what are them birds doing? They're out there looking for food. Well, it's a very common bird, and you probably know that there's a massive rookery. There was at Seahorse Key for decades. They were spooked a while ago. They relocated the rookery to Snake Key, which is the island immediately to the east of it. They're still there. One of the biggest rookeries in the Gulf of Mexico is right there in the Cedar Key area. Well, we took the bones of these ibises to our ornithologist at the Florida Museum of Natural History, Dave Stedman, and we knew they were weird because most of them were unfused. So when you're a juvenile, the distal elements of your long bones are not fused to the shaft so that you can grow. They're called epiphyses and diaphysis, right? And so these were unfused. You guys can see right here, right? There's some of them that are unattached, right? There's pieces down here that are missing. So Dave looked at them and said, well, they're juvenile. And there was a study done on Seahorse Key years ago looking at the development sequence of ibises. So Dave was able to tell us, well, these were killed mid to late June. Summer solstice, right? Okay, all right, you got it. Okay, thank you. Sometimes I get to that point and there's like this total dead silence. They're like, okay, so what? Mid to late June, summer solstice. All right. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm almost done. This is a tidal fish trap that was discovered by a local citizen, a retired geologist. He told us about this, and for years I didn't believe it, and then finally we started coring it. Turns out that Native American people there at the time that Shell Mound was hosting all these feasts built this seawall of oyster shell and entrapped these tidal ponds so that they could go in there. You wait for the fish to come in to feed at high tide. You put a little net across there. At low tide, you got fish in a barrel. Just walk in there through it with a drag net. You literally can get thousands of fish out of there pretty quickly. Okay, so last thing. Shell Mound, as I told you, had an evolution. So for 200 years, they did these solstice feasts. Probably every year. We don't know that for sure, but there's a lot of pits, a lot of fish bone, and a lot of ibis bone, a lot of pottery in the dune sands. Whoops. But starting at about 600, or around 600 AD, people in Zoom, the one on the right here, you'll see the red coloration. They dug up shell from their first 200 years of occupation, from this area right here in the middle that's red. They dug up shell out of here, and they placed it there to create a U-shaped amphitheater with an enclosed plaza. And then shortly thereafter, they left. All right, leaving could be seen as failure. Abandonment is failure in the minds of Western people like ourselves. To leave a place is to give up. We've given up. My interpretation, based on Native American philosophy, is that their work was done. All these summer solstice feasts were to bring back the balance between the water world, which is their lower world, and the earth, which is their middle world, the world of humans. This is the upper world, the world of supernatural forces that can be manipulated and predicted. They basically succeeded at what they were trying to achieve, which was rebalancing the world that was run, that had fallen into imbalance because of the rising water of AD 200. So where did they go? We know they went to Central Florida. We know that some went north and some went south along the coast. And for the next several centuries, they continued to come back to the place they lived and celebrated the summer solstices to emplace more objects into Palmetto Mound, just like we saw with the soapstone vessels. Connecting the past with the future and through the present seems to be a real high priority for them. So let me just leave it at that then. I have plenty more I could share with you. I know we want to have a few questions. I probably have already burned up most of my time. But I think this is the thing that non-Western people have that we don't have that we could draw on. It's going to take a different change of thinking about capitalism, about the permanence of place, about our relationship to our ancestors, about our obligation to future generations. You guys know the seventh generation philosophy? Yeah, there's a product line now of biodegradable soaps and things. So for the Iroquois, sometimes they say it's 7 generations out. That's 150 years forward thinking. Some people say 3 generations back, this generation, 3 generations forward is 7 generations. But it's the idea that basically we have this obligation through generations to work together to maintain balance and harmony in the world through reciprocity and co-creation. Humans helped create the earth and the origin stories of Native North America. They weren't just passive recipients of the creation, the great creation. They were part of the creation, and they have this reciprocal relationship to all those others that co-created the earth too, like all the animals of their lives, for instance. So that kind of philosophy is important, I think, to think about. I don't know how you translate this into practice. If we all thought like this, I think we'd still be living off the land and not building skyscrapers and so forth. I'm not here to criticize any of that. It is what it is. Our history is what it is. And I don't think we can go back and give up our Western history and traditions to live off the land like this. I'm moving to the Appalachians. I don't know what you guys are doing, but we're far enough away from the coast. I think what you're going to see is all the climate refugees are going to show up here. Yeah. So, yeah, I hope you like seafood. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Hey, question.
Oh, Lord, did I go that long? Meeting is hard at 3:30. I got time. I'm sorry.
No, it was.
I'm kind of long-winded.
Get your mic back, please. Ms. Dr. Sassaman. Yep, there we go.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
Questions?
Is it green?
Thank you.
Dueling microphones.
Dueling microphones. Can you hear me?
Can you sing?
No? No?
Oh, I hear you fine. Hear you.
Well, it's for the Zoom folks on the recording.
Oh,
Thank you. All right, you take that one back.
this is not a question, but I just want you to know there's a wonderful woman in the back row, Patsy Nelms, who has
Bird Island.
history of a place over there.
Hi, haven't seen you in a long time. How are you? Good. Yeah? I think we still have some of your soapstone too.
Can you repeat for the
to see you.
recording? Ken, can you please repeat for the recording what just happened here?
Patsy's the owner of Bird Island, which had one of the 3 cemeteries we were talking about. Her and her husband availed their lovely home and the island for archaeological investigations there. We put in 2 1x2 meter units years ago. Paulette McFadden, who's now an archaeologist at the Bureau of Archaeological Research, did her dissertation based on that data and some coring in the Horseshoe Cove area. So it's so good to see you again. Your husband passed. Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you.
It's so good to see you, though. Thank you for being here.
Other comments, questions? Yes.
The bones that you showed that you were digging up and I look like meter square plots and relocating, how do you know just from the bones that they were relocated a long distance?
I don't. I think all I can say with confidence is that they were secondary. And all that means is that doesn't mean they were in the ground initially. They could have been stored in scaffoldings or charnel houses until they were defleshed. or they could have been deliberately defleshed. But I think if we saw them deliberately defleshed, we would see cut marks on the bone from taking the flesh off the bone. So I don't think that happened. The bone was pretty well preserved. So all I can say is that they were secondary in the sense that they weren't buried in the flesh. And then if we wanted to figure out if they came from really far away, the teeth could be analyzed for stable isotopes. The molars, you can see the groundwater that was being consumed over the time the first, second, and third molars were forming. So you could do a biography of some geography of someone's biography based on the isotopic ratios. I can't remember which elements are important, oxygen. So John Krigbaum in my department does that for a living. And so we know, for instance, there's a cemetery at Tick Island on the St. John's. This is in the Woodruff National Wildlife Refuge that has individuals that were born and raised as far north as Virginia.
Wow. And could you tell the age of them by, say, carbon dating?
No, we couldn't do any destructive analysis at all. We couldn't do the isotopes. We couldn't do radiocarbon dating because of the sensibilities of the Seminole, and we abide by that. I'm not going to ever argue with Native American people about materials that ultimately are theirs, and it's their history. I'm privileged to have an opportunity to work on stuff like that. So no destructive analysis. So my inference about the age of those is the associated spear points. They're big, long stem points that are made between 5,000 and 4,000 years ago in the Southeast. Pretty common.
Okay, one more question.
Along the coast, in the Gulf of Mexico, at what point do the parabolic dunes disappear? Were they no longer made?
That's a good question. I don't know how far. I mean, they certainly go up. I know that they exist up in the South Carolina coastal plain, across the Georgia coastal plain. They're not, along the Panhandle. I don't know. That's a good question. I'll look into that. Okay. Yeah.
I guess you agree this was a remarkable presentation. I personally am stunned by the spiritual aspect of archaeology and paleo-humans. I just thank you for that perspective. I didn't have it.
Yeah, it's kind of new for me too.
Yeah, you do a good job interpreting it. So thank you. Well, I hope you will come back and talk to us a little bit more. Okay.
You guys are welcome to come visit our labs too anytime you want. We're just off of Radio Road on campus. Show you artifacts. Show you. We got 7 stray cats.
Should do a field trip.
For a cat.
Okay. Okay, good. Thank you all. Thank you, Zooms.